All right, welcome back to another episode of The Shadows of Jesus. My name is Jeff Martin, and I'm joined by
Bill Jolly.
And so, man, we're almost done with the Old Testament. We're going through every book of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation.
37 books.
Deep in the Old Testament. There's how many in the Old Testament?
39.
39, so we're getting close. But we really want to show how all of Scripture is about Jesus. And so there's shadows of Jesus leading us to the New Testament. Then it's explicitly about Jesus, but it's still all about him. And so we want to show that in this time in this podcast. So
I love it.
Well, today for this, we could have covered half of First Chronicles, and we decided let's just push every First and Second Chronicles into
one episode
next week, which allows us to. After last week, we had so much
flying through.
When we're just going to slow down on the Italian prophet that you call
Malachi
or Malachi.
Malachi.
All right. So real quick, Malachi comes along after Haggai and Zechariah. The temple's complete. Worship has been restored by the works of Ezra. But the expectations for Israel was that, hey, after this happens, we're going to enter into like this messianic period. So all the blessings, the restoration should have occurred. And now they're going like, things haven't changed.
Yeah.
And so this leads them to basically kind of go back to all their old ways. So kind of what's happening in Israel, in Jerusalem at the time of Malachi?
Yeah. So it really is like a replaying of the way that they were responding earlier in struggling in covenant faithfulness, in how they were worshiping God. It reminds me of some of those early prophets that we read, where God says, I hate your festivals. There's a problem with your worship.
Yeah.
There's the way that you're treating the poor, the way that you're treating the marginalized, the way that you're treating each other. There's all these problems. And so the priesthood has become corrupt. Worship is stagnant. There's divorce that's widespread, and people are not giving. So it's got a lot of things for Malachi to
and
address.
a lot of this stuff is really applicable to us today. So we'll try to get into some of the questions that maybe normally we'd have to go through quickly. Maybe we can kind of hunker down.
Slow down on this. Yeah, that's
So
good.
so chapters 1 and 2 have some disputes between God and Israel. Really, the whole book is 6 disputes, more or less. But chapters 1 and 2 give us the first 3. The first dispute happens when God says, "I love you."
Great opening.
Yeah, and that love is the tense there in the Hebrew is like, I always have loved you, I do love you, and I always will love you. So it's this forever, never-ending love. He's like, I love you. Nothing can ever change that. And how do they respond?
How have you loved us?
And it's almost like, it's not like, I'm curious, how? Tell me, God, like how? It's more
Really?
Spiteful. It's like, how?
We're not experiencing these
Yeah,
all these blessings.
And so how does God explain to them that he loves them?
He talks about how he's chosen them.
Yeah,
and how he
and
didn't
this,
choose others.
And this gets really controversial. I mean, especially when you see that Paul quotes it
in Romans
9. So what does he more or less say?
So he literally says, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. Jacob referring to all the Israelites, and then Esau referring to his descendants.
Yeah. So if we back way up to Genesis, which is a lot of episodes ago, you have these 3 patriarchs in Israel. So you have Father Abraham and many sons. Then Abraham has Isaac and Esau. Ishmael. And then so God's like, all right, I've got 2 here. I'm going to go through Isaac. Then Isaac has 2 sons, twins.
Right.
Jacob and Esau. Yeah. And who comes out first?
Esau.
And Jacob. What's Jacob doing?
He's hold on, I'm coming too.
He's holding on that ankle. And so technically, like, the lineage you'd think would go through the firstborn, but God here says, like, no, before you're even born, like, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. So that word loved, what does that word love mean?
Yeah, this is such a troubling verse when you hear this. And but if you consider in the terms of by love that he's meaning I choose.
Yeah, so it's not an affection,
right,
but a choice.
And then when he says I hated, which that really strikes, kind of smacks you in the face. It's referring to rejection, not the animosity that we might typically associate with that word hated.
And I love what you pointed out. Like, this is not just talking about two people as individuals, but talking about nations. So from Jacob comes the nation of Israel, and from Esau come the Edomites. Yeah. So essentially, God's saying, look, from Adam to the coming Messiah, I'm continually having to make a choice on who will carry this lineage forward. And I've chosen over and over and over again to continue this lineage through Jacob.
Yeah.
Like I've chosen the lesser, I've chosen the smaller tribe, and he's like, that's my way of showing I love you. And so anything else to these verses? Like before we, I've got some other thoughts we can dive into, but did you like, as your wrestle with that, was there anything else that stood out to you?
It's just, I think that to say that, well, we're going to unpack how God's choosing I chose you and I've blessed you. I've done all these things. And then, and that's what he's emphasizing. But when you read the passage, you see mostly he talks about, the Edomites, and they're not blessed.
He talks about what did he do to the Edomites?
That he judged them, and that
as like destroying them.
I'm not taking care of them.
And so I think if I was like, Bill, I love you, and you're like, how? You're like, I'm like, I did really bad things to people.
Right. It sounds like
you'd be like, I don't know.
Really?
Like I'd rather have like some cool stuff for me versus some bad things for them. So here's as I was diving into this, because I've heard that, that Paul has a different meaning to this story than Malachi did. And I would agree actually that Malachi is talking about nations. And I think when you dive into Romans 9, you see it's about the choosing of individuals, where this is absolutely not about individuals, but the nations beyond them. But here's what's interesting. Was Jacob any better of a person than Esau?
No.
All right. So now we've gone through the whole Old Testament almost. Is Israel any better than the Edomites?
No.
So what I think is going on here is I think the Edomites receive justice and Israel has received mercy. So I think what God's saying here in the way that he's displaying his love is saying, like my love is displayed to you in that I give you mercy, that I've withheld. Like, so the Edomites, that's a picture of what you have earned. It's a picture of what you deserve. And the fact that I've chosen to withhold that, it's like, so my love is displayed to you in my mercy. Yeah. And therefore, I think when you get to Romans 9, actually that application is very much the same, because the question is like, that's not fair. Like, how could God predestine some to salvation and not others? That's not fair. And I think Paul's argument is, no. God is fair. Some people receive mercy, some people receive justice, but no one receives unfairness.
Right. Election's not about fairness. It's actually a demonstration of mercy and grace, of kindness.
And but what I think is shown here is like God's love is displayed in his mercy. And so I think he's showing them, like, so they're saying how he's like, my mercy, like my mercy is a picture of my love towards you. And so, so that's kind of where, which I think that, so with that concept though, of justice and mercy, when we get to some further disputes, I think we'll see that that's actually going to be a common theme that needs to be explored in Malachi. So that's why I think it's more about justice and mercy, because I think it ties into the other disputes. So what's the next dispute, Bill?
Yeah, second dispute happens when God says that they have despised him and defiled the temple. You see those words used several times. And then the people they respond back, how? How have we done that?
Yeah, he's like, and he's like, have you seen the animals you brought to me?
On the Bible Project video, I think one of this like this sheep with sores all over and it's puking. It's so gross. It was great.
I just imagine I remember when I lived in Texas in high school, we had the stock show and rodeo came through every year, and that was a big deal. And so I was one of my classes, I actually had to miss school to go and help out and volunteer at the stock show. And one of the things I volunteered with was the petting zoo. And one of the goats had like a crazy eye, and it was like so it would look at you, but one eye was always looking over here. And so we cracked up at that thing. And so when I think about the second class, or the sloppy second sacrifices, I think of that goat like with its eye
on the side. Yes.
Looking over. But they're giving God the sloppy seconds.
Junk.
Yeah, they're junk. Yeah. And he's like, bring that to your governor and see how he would accept this junk that you're bringing to me. And so I guess they couldn't argue it. But when I was reading this week, something that stood out to me is thinking about, okay, so the sacrifices, they're bringing their sloppy seconds, their junk. And it's like, well, okay, so we're not called to make a sacrifice anymore, like a living sacrifice of an animal.
Yes.
But Romans 12
Yes.
calls us to be a living sacrifice, which means, okay, so we should give God our best, not our seconds. And why? Because God gave us his best.
Yeah.
And so I think I think this is a picture of honoring him through our best, realizing like God didn't hold back on us. He didn't give us his sloppy seconds. He's like, I'm gonna give you my one and only son.
Yeah.
So that was impactful for me, is reading that in light of Romans 12 and what it means to be a living sacrifice had some significance for me personally as I was reading. Anything for you?
Yeah. I mean, it does. It says, it made me think about what's the quality of our worship. And, the Lord says that here's this matters to him, and that and we know that he's worthy of our best. And it's like, what am I bringing to him? And I thought of some questions for it. I said, because we don't have to bring animals anymore. That's not part of our, so I'm not going out there, picking a 3-legged sheep with its eye hanging off the side of its head or whatever. But what do I offer to him? And I think first, am I offering my whole life, Romans 12, to him? Am I seeking to live a holy life? And then am I gathering regularly with other Christians to offer him praise? Like he really, for whatever reason, he likes, that's worship. Yeah. That's an offering, the fruit of my lips. Or, do I show up and I'm apathetic, I'm disengaged, I'm not willing to lift up my voice to offer that to him? And I just sensed him highlighting those things. Is he first in my finances? We're going to get, that comes in later in the book about tithing. But those are some things that I just thought about with what does worship look like for us? Yeah, whole life and praising and coming to him. Those kinds of things.
That's good. There's a book that I really like called The Contrarian's Guide to Spirituality. I think,
is that Larry Osborne?
By Larry Osborne. Yeah, and so he has these things that he articulates it so well that I go, I've always thought that, I just don't know how to word it. And now that you said it, I'm like, that makes sense. But one of the things he has in there is like, stop putting God first in your life. Which I think you hear that and you're like, what do you mean? Like, we're talking about sloppy seconds here. And he says, like, at what point, like, if you say, like, God deserves the first of my time today, like, at what point is that enough? Like, is it 15 minutes? Is it an hour? Is it 3 hours? Like you never know, like, if he's first, like, how much is enough? And so he said, instead of thinking it as like God's your first on a list of other priorities, think of him as the foundation that all the priorities exist from. And so he's not the top and then everything else comes underneath him. It's like, no, he's the foundation and it affects everything else. And so I think about like that first, giving God your best is like, it's like, hey, I want God to be the foundation of the way I work. I want God to be the foundation of the way that I handle my finances. I want God to be the foundation. So it's more,
it's like I'm thinking about God as the foundation. I'm thinking that it's the thing that comes to me and and I filter everything else through that.
So then everything becomes worship.
Yeah. And then, and I think like their first fruits offering is like, this is symbolic of, it's all his. Yeah. And I'm trusting him for everything in that. So.
That's good.
Yeah.
So that gets us to the third dispute. And so the third dispute happens when God exposes the men.
Yeah.
What are they doing?
So instead of loving their wives, they're divorcing them.
Yeah, and not only are they divorcing their wives, but what else are they doing?
They were also marrying foreign women who were worshiping foreign gods. That was the big issue.
Yeah, so the big thing here is like, this is not about interracial marriage. It's not saying like, you can't, if you're white, you can't marry someone who's black. If you're Mexican, you can't marry someone who's
Italian.
And I realized, like I just said, this is a side tangent.
Yeah.
San Antonio is where I grew up. It's not uncommon to hear someone say, in Texas, in San Antonio, we didn't move, the border did. And so there's great pride in saying that we are Mexican. And if you say Spanish, like, oh, you're Hispanic, they're like, that's Spanish descent, or Latino, that's of Latin descent. They're like, no, we're Mexican, we're proud of it.
Where you grew up, that was...
So I grew up, like, you like, if you call someone who's Mexican Spanish, that's like offensive.
Oh, really?
And so now, but I realize in Tennessee, if I say that, people like, they're almost like, oh, you can't say that, you gotta say Hispanic. And I'm like, so
it's cultural difference.
So to our audience,
that's just to explain where Jeff's from. So that was
to my
good.
audience.
So
the offensive thing from my background is to say Hispanic instead of saying Mexican.
I didn't know that.
Anyways, that's a total.
Well, at any rate,
so it's not talking about marrying people who are of other ethnicities. It's talking about people marrying people who worship
other gods,
because those gods are going to pull your heart away from the one true
right.
God. And so that's what they're doing here. So God hates divorce. Why? Like, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, why does God hate divorce?
Yeah. Well, and so first of all, marriage is meant to image God's love toward us.
Yeah.
And Paul talks about this mystery of Christ and his bride.
Yeah.
And so it shows us that. And it also, when we're faithful to our spouses, that's a message to the world
Of God's love towards us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They see that.
So when we were like, I'm fully committed. I know all your flaws. I'm not going anywhere. I'm madly in love with you. Nothing's going to change that. Like, I will be faithful to you. That's meant to tell the world that's how God looks
loves
at
us, which is this ultimate relationship of faithfulness and love. That love, I have loved you from the very beginning. Beginning of Malachi.
I always have. I do. Always will. Nothing can change it.
Yeah, and so when we're imaging that, we're displaying that to others, that they're seeing this is what God is like. And it's the flourishing of that relationship, and human flourishing can't happen without that kind of love, without those kinds of marriages. That's God's designed humanity to flourish through marriages that where we sustain them, we stick it out.
Yeah, and so when we divorce, it preaches a different message.
Yeah.
It says that type of love can end.
Yeah.
And so for God, the thought of saying like, hey, I want Christian marriages to paint a picture of a love that will never end. And when it does end, it's like we're preaching a message that says like, actually God's love could stop.
Yeah.
And he's like, the thought of people thinking my love could ever end, the thought of people thinking that like you could do something so bad that I would call it quits on you when I've committed myself to you, like God, that breaks God in a way. He says like the thought of anybody thinking that I could stop loving them destroys me. Like that's why I hate divorce. I hate it because of the message it preaches. If the message is meant to be, this is a picture of God's love towards us, he wants the message to be never ending.
Yeah.
Nothing can change it.
Yeah.
But if we divorce, all of a sudden the message becomes like, actually there is something that can change it.
And I think it's important too, when, so this verse in the historic versions, it literally, you'll read it and it says, I hate divorce. If you read, in the ESV, they've got that as a footnote because there's a lot of debate about how that's translated. And I think that when you read that, it's important it doesn't say that he hates the people that get divorces.
That's so good.
Because if you've been through that, people that are listening to this, you know how painful it is. And I think that is, and God does not hate you.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the other reasons that God does that divorce is it is so painful, and he doesn't want to see that.
Yeah.
Because he loves you and he loves us. And I was talking actually at dinner, divorce came up, and I was talking with my son about that. And it's like when you take two pieces of wood and you use wood glue, and you put those together and you let that cure, and when you glue like two 2x4s together with wood glue, if you then try to actually like pry it apart, the two pieces of wood will shred, but because of where the glue was so strong.
Yeah.
And what God does when we marry, and it's a supernatural joining of two souls, and that's the thing that is so hard about divorce, is that it is ripping you apart.
Yeah.
And I think that also is why divorce is so, it's God's like, no. This is not what's good for you. This is going to rip you apart.
And that's so marriage isn't just two pieces coming together. The way that Tim Keller and Kathy Keller explain it is like you have a pile of sodium and a pile of chloride. Is it sodium chloride? Is that the word I'm thinking of? What makes up salt?
I'm not a science guy.
I think
Carter's giving us the yes.
All right, so he's like salt isn't just a pile of sodium and a pile of chloride. It's like it comes together and creates a whole new compound. It's a whole new thing.
Yeah.
And so in the same way, like marriage, it's not just a man and a woman that come together and are two separate things that are together. It's like, no, you become
bonded.
one. Yeah. And so then you rip that oneness apart. But I think it's so important. Like if we were doing a sermon series in Malachi, it'd be tough to stand before people and preach this, because I'd be looking through the room and seeing people that we know, that we love, that we care about, who've walked through this or who are walking through this. And like you said, you see it, and it's like even the people who have biblical grounds for it are still going through the ringer because it's messy, it's painful. And I would think, most people are like, I wouldn't wish this upon
anybody.
What it's doing to me, what it's doing to our kids, what it's doing to our extended families,
community.
I remember I did a wedding for a couple that was their second marriage, and both of them went through divorces, and I would say that were biblically grounded years and years and years ago. But they said, Jeff, if you could see the impact it's having on our kids now, they say, because our kids now have kids, and our grandkids are being divided amongst all these tensions. And he's like, if you could see the effect isn't just you, the effects even just your kids, like even down to the grandkids, you see this pain. And so I think God in his kindness is like, hey, I also don't want you to get divorced because I don't want you to go through the pain. So with that being said, here's one of the questions that came in, like, are there biblical grounds for divorce? And so we've kind of alluded to that already, but so what are some examples that you would say if someone said, is there a biblical grounds for divorce?
So many people would say it's a fair interpretation as you read the New Testament that in the case of marital infidelity,
so adultery,
and also perhaps in the case of abandonment, that those are biblical grounds for the marriage to be for divorce, for the marriage to be considered to be done. So you've got those.
And so we're there's some good theologians out there, right? And so I don't want people to think that we only go to one. Like I love J.I. Packer's concise theology. We went through the doctrine book by Paul Tripp. That was so good. And like you have John Frame, others, but we typically will mention Wayne Grudem.
We just like him. I like Wayne.
He's so well thought out. But he has a book as big as his systematic theology book called Ethics. And he writes on divorce, and he lands on there's two grounds: adultery and desertion or abandonment. And then he comes back in 2019. A friend challenged him on this, and so he did like a deep dive on a phrase that's not found anywhere else in Scripture in cases such as, and looks at all these other Greek instances outside of Scripture for how that phrase is used. And so he, without getting into too technical of a argument here, he basically shows that things that cause as much damage as divorce or desertion could also be
biblical grounds.
And so with that, he added in not necessarily like a one, like, so it's case by case, I guess you could say. So it requires discernment and counsel, but he would say things like physical abuse, verbal abuse, dangerous threats to the family, addictions that are hopeless, harmful, habitual. And so he would say there's other things that if they are causing as much damage as adultery or abandonment, that those two could be biblical grounds. And so he actually amended what he wrote in his book Ethics, and so
he expanded that.
And I read through his arguments, and I said it's pretty strong. But I said it requires a level of discernment and wisdom and prayer to make any type of judgment on that. But here's what I think is interesting. If we're going off of technicalities, I would say that God has grounds to divorce us, but he won't. And so just because there are grounds for divorce, I would always counsel a couple like, hey, this isn't the first option. Like, let's seek reconciliation. Let's fight for this thing.
Right.
I'm not saying that and so to know that there very well could be a point where we say like, hey, this is what we need to do. But I would say like, let's not the first step be like, there's grounds, let's do it. Yeah. It's, hey, let's fight for the marriage. Let's because that's also a beautiful picture to the world that we're in.
It is. And that's the other flip side of this passage is that it has some incredible descriptions of marriage and the purpose of it. In verse 15, he says, "Did he not make them one?" That's the beauty of marriage, becoming one. And then with a portion of the Spirit in their union, that there's that supernatural bonding. And what was the one God seeking? Godly offspring.
Yeah.
And that would be a fruit of the marriage is kids that come to know him.
Yeah.
And so that's good stuff for marriage. And then he says, so guard yourself. And I think this, if you're listening to this right now and your marriage is struggling, and or maybe there's somebody at the gym that you've been talking to that you should not be talking to. It says, especially fellas, because he says, guard yourself in your spirit, and let none of you be faithless to the wife of your youth. Guard yourself in your spirit. And so I think it gives us the beauty of a beautiful picture of marriage, and then a strong encouragement to guard ourselves, to protect that.
Yeah, so it reminds me of I ripped this off from J.D. Greer when we went through the Kings. We went through Solomon, Saul, David, and Solomon.
Yeah.
And we looked at Solomon's life, and one of the questions we asked in the application was basically like, if God was going to completely wreck your life and destroy you in 3 years, like how would he do it? And what seed would be planted today that if gone unchecked could lead down that path?
Yeah.
So thinking through that, it's like, those, like guard it.
Yeah.
Guard it. Yeah.
Good.
So that gets us to the very end of chapter 2. Going to chapter 3, we're introduced to the fourth dispute. So what's going on here in the fourth one?
Yeah. So they've wearied God by their words, by questioning his justice.
Yeah.
Are you going to take care of these wicked people? What's going on?
Yeah. So would you read verses 1 through 4 of chapter 3?
Yeah.
This is kind of his response to like when they're like, how have we wearied you?
Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. And the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. But who can endure the day of his coming? And who can stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire and like fuller's soap. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, and he will purify the sons of Levi and refine them like gold and silver, and they will bring offerings in righteousness to the Lord.
Yeah, so basically what he's saying here is like, you guys are the ones who broke things. So when they're questioning the justice, it's like, you guys are the one who broke things, but I'm going to come and fix it. So that's really probably the biggest shadow of Jesus, maybe the only one.
Yes.
But the big one here is like you have the messenger, which is a picture of Elijah, who in the New Testament is often John the Baptist. All right. So you have John the Baptist preparing the way of the Lord, fulfillment of prophecies we saw in Isaiah. And then he comes before the Lord, which we know to be Jesus. And then it seems like they're kind of always dissatisfied with this temple, right? And what temple does Jesus show up to?
This temple.
This very temple, yeah. So like when we look at the injustice in the world, it's like it's a result of our sin, but God's going to send a messenger to prepare the way for the one who will come and fix all that we've broken.
Yeah. And, there's something when we talk about the structure of the book, and it's 6 disputes, and there's also a pretty obvious chiastic structure, even in the themes from the first to the 6th, the second to the 5th, the third to the 4th. But you get here in the middle of all of this, and that's where you see Jesus.
Yeah. Right there.
Down with that. Boom. Right in the middle. Here's the important part.
Anything else on that?
No, I think, yeah.
Okay. So the 5th dispute's about Israel robbing God. So how are they doing that?
They're not tithing.
What was the tithe meant to be for? Like what? Because there's more than just a tithe in the Old Testament, but this was for
this is the one for the maintaining the temple, for worship, for taking care of the priests and all the things that they would need.
Yeah. So we've addressed this before. Maybe it's a good refresher. Is tithing required in the New Testament?
And we're not under the law.
Yeah.
But there's a continuity in the things that God was teaching through the Old Testament and through these things that continues. So giving still matters. It's still it's a wonderful form of worship and trusting the Lord, and an opportunity. And we're obviously, our materialism and greed is, we want to put that to death.
Yeah.
But that there's a continuity there. And so we see, and it's a fair question to say, what financially, where is my heart at?
Yeah.
Because where my treasure is, there will my heart be also. So, if you're going to nutshell this.
I definitely, I think, I remember the first time I heard this when I was in college. Because I grew up tithing. Like from a very young age. I remember in Blytheville, Arkansas, before I was 5 years old, being given money for unloading the dishwasher. Like a couple, some dimes or something. And then I would take, and my parents taught me the principle of tithing, what I earned from my chores. So I would take, my change that I made, and I would go and I'd put that in the offering plate. So so when I worked in high school, washing cars and selling cars in college and seminary, like I always had this. So just for me, tithing has always been rhythmic. And I remember in college, someone tithing's not in the New Testament. I was like, what? Yeah. Cause I was like, you're right. But I love the way that you think about, okay, if people in the Old Testament were tithing, and they only had a partial revelation of the Christ to come, how much more should we give?
Yeah.
With a full revelation of the Christ who came, it'll come again. And so I would say, like, man, I think tithing's still a great principle to live by, but even like let that be the starting point. And but doing so with a generous and joyful heart,
right?
In response to not to earn God's favor, but in response to His favor.
Yeah, and that's how Paul teaches giving in the New Testament. It's helpful. You read over that, and he's like, you've received. He's been generous towards us, you've experienced His grace, and now let that create in you the grace to give. And so I think if you're I don't have to tithe. That means I don't have to give anything to the to the church. I think something's really broken in your heart.
Yeah.
Because if Jesus is Lord and you want to see His kingdom advance, and you want to see things happen, money fuels the things that happen in this world. And either it's going to be fueling things that are evil and opposed to God, or it can fuel His mission going forward. And so if God's blessed people that are listening to this and given them, it says He gives people the ability to generate wealth, then think about, man, we're thinking about what can we do? Or if you're just a college student and you got $5, your $5 that's a blessing. Give that to the Lord, like the lady that had the 2 pennies, but say, I want to see His kingdom go forward. That's where my heart is. So I give to it. But you don't have to fall under, there's a saying in some churches, got to get the curse out the purse.
Never heard that before.
Based on this passage about if you don't give, God's going to curse your money.
So we don't want to see it as like a cursing to not give. We also don't want to see it as a way of manipulating God. Like I gave, therefore He's got to return it tenfold. It's like we're not looking at the prosperity gospel.
No,
but really just like a joyful heart of saying, like I think about it. Like if you said, Jeff, I want to give you a 10% raise, I'd be like, oh, that'd be awesome. Like I could buy this, and like it was like thinking through, like I could just stop tithing and get a 10% raise, but like I don't want to.
Right.
Like I can sit there and go like. I think it's like, because it's a joy to be able to say, like, God, I want to see what you're doing. I want to be a part. I want to take part in what you're doing in the world, and I want to help. I want to help be a part of that. So
it's when you think about seeing the good things that God is doing, and just let your heart flow with that, and let generosity flow, and then I think you're experiencing the gospel giving.
Yeah. So that gets us to the sixth and final dispute. It's about people thinking it's pointless to serve God. Like, why do they think it's pointless, Bill?
Yeah, well, basically they're looking around, they're seeing the people who are bad and they're doing just fine, and it's really it's the same question from dispute 1. So the chiastic pattern there. How have you loved us? Because these guys are doing fine and we're not. What's up with us?
They're looking around like it's like the people who are wicked are doing great. The people who we thought were your people are doing bad.
Where are our blessings?
And so it's kind of that back, is there any justice in the world? And so I think on one hand, they're asking God for justice, but the truth is they don't want justice. Like they want other people to receive justice while they continue to serve mercy. Like they're saying, why don't you serve justice? I'm like, do you really want that? Because remember the Edomites? If you get justice, that's
what it looks like.
That's what it gets. That's what I think about. I remember in high school, my pastor preached a message, and he was talking about hell, and just someone in the sanctuary. It was you could people talk back sometimes, amens, and someone said that's not fair, and I remember like in stride, he goes, if you want fair, you get hell.
Oh yeah, it's true.
And I was like, oh yeah, you're right. Maybe I don't want fair. I'll take the mercy. But this dispute reminds me of the difference, kind of when we talk about the difference between Proverbs and Job. It's kind of like, in Job's questions, like, is there is there a principle of justice that's just like really simple in the world? Like if you do bad, you get punished. If you do good, you get rewarded. And Job just blows that idea up and shows like, hey, the world's way too complicated for it to work. That like it'd be great, but it can't. The world at this point in redemptive history is not designed to function in that way. So it leaves us with a lot of just having to lean in and trust God. So why would God allow some form of injustice? Well, because that enables the cross. Because that obviously was an act of injustice. Like Jesus didn't deserve that. So why would he allow us to still live in a world where we can experience injustice? There's something formative about it, but that's even still, that's still too thin of an answer to the complexities of it. But I think there's a level of saying like, we've got to trust God.
We do. Yeah. Trusting him. And then, I think it's Psalm 73. That's, my foot had almost slipped. I looked at how the wicked were prospering and I was like, man, forget it. I'm going to go do that.
Yeah.
And then he says, I went to the house of the Lord. He got into God's presence. He remembered who God was and what the bigger story is. And this bigger story is, this is a moment, this pilgrimage, this side of eternity, and then there's eternity, and God is going to make all things new. He's going to when he said, "I considered the end of the wicked."
Yeah,
it may look good now, but there will be justice, and also my end there will be mercy.
Yeah.
So
that response kind of gets us into chapter 4 where the thing wraps up.
Yeah,
and so he talks about how there's going to be this day. That's not just answering the last dispute, but really all of them. And I love the imagery there. Like it's going to be a day of healing, which I think is awesome.
Yeah,
it talks about calves
leaping
out of the
happy cows.
So happy cows, so great. What kind of milk are they producing? But he talks about on that day though, it's going to be really hot for those who are wicked. So like the justice will receive. Yeah, so the wicked will receive what they deserve. He's like a burning oven where people will be set ablaze. But for people who serve God, it's healing. It's calves leaping from the stall. But as we get to the end there, Malachi, it wraps up by pointing us back, because this is the last book before the New Testament.
Yeah.
So we're going to go back and read 1st and 2nd Chronicles, but this is the last words before we get to Jesus. And so it looks back and he says, remember the law of Moses. But then it looks forward. How does it look forward? He talks about sending someone.
I will send you Elijah the prophet.
Yeah. So it ends by saying, like, look back and remember God's faithfulness. Look forward to his promises. And I think that's what helps us to live in the moment of today. So I've got one final thought.
Okay.
And then I'll let you have the closing remarks. As far as the questions we had come in, we're divorce and tithing. Did anything else come up from your end? Shadow of Jesus, I think was 3 verse 1, the messenger of the Lord.
Right.
So something that blew me away with Malachi, and this was from about 2 years ago, but I was reminded of it as we were studying it again, is that in chapter 1, verse 6, God speaks to Israel as a father. So the words of God are coming to his people from the posture, from the heart of a good dad.
Yeah.
And then it wraps up in 4:6 talking about fathers and their children. Like he's going to draw children to their fathers. And I just think it's really interesting because like it's this father imagery in Malachi. And then after this father imagery, this father voice, this father imagery, this father desire, there's 400 years of silence. And God is reintroduced after 400 years of saying not a thing by the words, "This is my son with whom I'm well pleased." And so speaking about this is my son, that puts the language of God once again speaking first and foremost as a father. Yeah. And if then we are in Christ, that means that Jesus is our older brother, but God is now our father, which means God creates the church to be a spiritual family. And so for me, like I think there's something significant for me to think about, like the father heart of God displayed in Malachi, the fact that after 400 years of silence, he ends the Old Testament with the father's heart. And then he begins the New Testament with the Father's heart. And just reminding us of who we are, that we are one, first and foremost, we are his beloved children. But as beloved children, we should now exist as a family, the family of God, in the way that we live as a church. But so that was kind of like that reminder was good for me to.
Sure. I see that. And the other thing that comes to mind is if you look at the structure of the book, and it talks about, the front and back on their questioning God and his love for them and his justice for them. But then as you work your way into 3 and 4, and then he talks about worship is the next layer down. But at the heart is the way that they're treating each other.
Yeah.
And so he's getting into the marriage and the divorce and those things. And this, I wonder too, if this might be picking back up on that theme, because our worship of God, our becoming his people, it changes the way we relate to him, but it also has a profound impact on the way we treat each other.
Yeah.
And so, and you see that in the way, and when he talked about marriage and the faithfulness there. And so I also wonder if there's something happening in this last verse where, the way that God is renewing the earth and what he's doing within the church it fits in this with these lines that he turns the hearts of the fathers to the children, and whether that's, I mean, you think about how families are just ripped apart, and how what's been so detrimental to society is what happens with dads when dads are pulled out of the home, when dads are not present, when there's just strife and insanity going on, in living rooms, and so he's maybe drawing our attention to this power of Christ to turn hearts of fathers to children and hearts of children to fathers. And that stood out to me. I was a school teacher for several years, and so I was with kids, and I was seeing our society, the whole cross section of it, represented through through kids. I did middle school for a while, and so you really get to see what our society's made of. And a friend of mine, we did a night of prayer, and we actually created this collage of photos of all the schools here in this region. And then we took this verse from Malachi, the last verse of the Old Testament, and put that on top of it as a prayer. For this is one of the signs of God's kingdom, would be families being healed. And if not within the family, of people becoming Christians and becoming part of churches where they find spiritual fathers, spiritual mothers, and that is, I think, could be something else that when we think about the hope of God's redemption, my goodness, what's one of the most painful things in life is a broken family. What's one of the most beautiful things would be family healed. Through God being our Father first. So
that reminds me of there's a pastor here in town who has a Sunday morning prayer gathering just for men. And like their men show up, and I love it. Like when you pull up next to the church's cars packed down the street, and it's just a bunch of dudes that are like, we're gonna pray.
Yes.
And so I was talking to him about the prayer time, and he goes, Jeff, when I do a wedding, he goes, I say this jokingly, but I mean it. He goes, I look at the groom, and I say, for a marriage to be healthy, it needs healthy men. For a family to be healthy, it needs a healthy marriage. For a church to be healthy, it needs, or for a family to be, I'm butchering this.
It's okay.
It's like basically for a marriage to be healthy, you need a healthy man. For a family to be healthy, you need healthy marriages. For a church to be healthy, you need healthy families. And for a nation to be healthy, you need healthy churches. And so he said, he looks at the group and basically says, basically the hope of our nation rests on you being a man.
No pressure.
a godly man. And so, but I think looking at that, there truly is something about healthy marriages, healthy families create healthy churches can create healthy societies, and healthy societies can impact the world. And so there is something to let's fight for healthy families. It's good. Good word. Well, next week, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and then Matthew.
All
right.
Turning over.
Good stuff.
Good.
All right. We'll be back next week.
See you then.